It is anyone's worst nightmare, trapped, naked, and needing to be rescued. But this time, the victim was the President of the United States, William Howard Taft, weighing over 350 pounds, created the most humiliating moment in White House history when he became hermetically sealed in his bathtub during his first days in office. 4 grown men had to use butter and cooking oil to lubricate and excavate the massive commander-in-chief. This is the tragicomic story of America's mountain of flesh and the custom-built bathtub large enough to hold 4 men that was engineered to save him. But who was this man before he became a punchline? Born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1857, William Howard Taft was American royalty. His father, Alphonso Taft, was a Titan who served as Attorney General and Secretary of War. William was not a self-made man. He was a carefully constructed monument to his father's legacy. He was the golden boy of the Taft dynasty, a Yale wrestling champion and a legal prodigy. Yet, even in his youth, the physical magnitude was there. He was always Big Lub, a man whose physical presence was as overwhelming as the expectations placed upon his shoulders. But as the pressure of these expectations grew, so did his body. By the time he reached the presidency, what the public saw as gluttony was actually a biological collapse. Modern medical historians, looking back at the detailed records of Taft's physicians, have concluded that the president was suffering from a condition known as Pickwickian syndrome, or obesity hypoventilation syndrome. It is a terrifying affliction. The sheer weight of the fat accumulation on his chest wall and diaphragm acted like a lead vest, physically preventing his lungs from expanding fully. Even when he was awake, he was suffocating. His shallow breathing meant he could never expel enough carbon dioxide. He was living in a state of chronic low-grade hypercapnia, carbon dioxide poisoning. The consequences of this poisoning were visible to everyone, though few understood the cause. The press called it laziness. His political enemies called it dim-wittedness. In reality, it was narcolepsy induced by oxygen deprivation. His brain, starved of fresh air and intoxicated by waste gases, would simply shut down to preserve function. He became famous for falling asleep, but these were not naps. They were microsleeps, uncontrollable blackouts. He fell asleep while signing important legislation, the pen trailing off the page. He fell asleep during cabinet meetings, his head lolling onto his chest, while his secretaries of state and war debated the fate of nations. Most humiliating of all, he was often seen falling asleep in the front row of funerals, or while standing up and receiving lines. For a man of immense intellect, a former Solicitor General, a Yale valedictorian, and a brilliant legal scholar, this was a psychological horror. Inside that mountain of flesh was a sharp, analytical mind that was screaming to be heard, but the biological machinery was failing. He was a prisoner in a cockpit that no longer responded to the controls. This physical imprisonment necessitated a complete restructuring of the world around him. Taft could not simply exist in the world as it was built. The world had to be reinforced to hold him. Following the bathtub disaster, he refused to ever be humiliated like that again. He ordered a solution that was industrial rather than medical. He commissioned the J.L. Mott Iron Works to cast a bathtub that could accommodate him. The specifications of this object were grotesque. It was 7 feet long and 41 inches wide. It weighed 2,000 pounds, a full ton of iron and porcelain. A famous photograph from the foundry shows 4 grown men sitting comfortably inside it, side by side, with room to spare. The tub was less a piece of furniture than an infrastructure project. When he traveled to inspect the Panama Canal aboard the USS North Carolina, the Navy had to hoist one of these Leviathan tubs onto the battleship. The ship's engineers were genuinely concerned that the concentrated weight of the tub, the water, and the president would punch a hole through the deck, so they had to install heavy steel beams to reinforce the floor of the captain's quarters. Even his movement through the Capitol required special engineering. Taft was the first president to enthusiastically adopt the automobile, largely because horse-drawn carriages had become treacherous. He had previously suffered the indignity of stepping into carriages that would visibly list and groan under his weight. He switched to the white steamer, an early steam-powered automobile. But stock models were insufficient. He required vehicles with wider doors, reinforced suspension systems, and custom-built seats that were essentially benches, allowing him to spread his bulk without being pinned by the armrests. Every day was a negotiation with gravity. His valet had to tie his shoes because the simple act of bending over cut off his windpipe completely. If he dropped a document on the floor of the Oval Office, it was gone, unreachable, unless he summoned an aide. He was the most powerful man on earth, commanding the armies and navies of the United States, yet he was physically helpless against a shoelace. The tragedy of William Howard Taft is that this physical grotesque was not the man he was meant to be. In his youth, he had been big, lub, yes, but he was powerful, a wrestler, a dancer who moved with surprising grace. Now, at the pinnacle of his career, he had become a static object, and the public noticed. They mocked him not just for being fat, but for the passivity that the fat represented. They saw a man who seemed to lack the will to control his own borders, let alone the nation's. But here lies the deeper mystery. A man does not reach 340 pounds by accident. The physics of the bathtub and the chemistry of his blood were just the symptoms. The food, the 12-ounce steaks for breakfast, the endless courses of heavy cream and sugar was a drug. It was an anesthetic. Taft was eating himself into a stupor for a reason. He was burying a brilliant, sensitive, and reluctant soul under a fortress of flesh because he was being forced to play a role he despised. The true mystery lay not in his inability to stop eating, but rather in the identity of those feeding the ambition that would eventually destroy him. The prison was built of flesh, but the guards who kept him there were the two people he loved most in the world. While the bathtub was the physical manifestation of Taft's imprisonment, the keys were held by others. A man does not simply become a 340-pound invalid by happenstance. Obesity of this magnitude, particularly in a man of such extraordinary discipline in legal matters, is almost always a symptom of a deeper, silent rebellion. It is a protective layer, a wall of flesh built to insulate the soul from the demands of the world. And in Taft's case, the demands came from two specific people. He was a prisoner of his own biology, yes, but his jailers were the two people he loved most in the world, his wife Helen Nellie Taft and his best friend Theodore Roosevelt. The tragedy of the Taft presidency was rooted in a simple, devastating truth. William never wanted the job, not for a single day. His ambition was entirely judicial. He was a creature of the courtroom. He loved the quiet, sterile logic of the law. He wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, a life of contemplation, robes, and written opinions. He craved the bench the way a drowning man craves oxygen. But he was married to a woman who viewed the Supreme Court as a graveyard for ambition. Helen Herron Taft, known to history as Nellie, was a woman of terrifying will. Physically, she was the opposite of her husband, slight, sharp-featured, and possessed of a nervous, electric energy that never allowed her to rest. She was the daughter of a judge, but she had no interest in the law. Her obsession was the executive. As a teenager, she had visited the White House during the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, and she had made a silent vow then and there that she would return not as a guest, but as the mistress of the mansion. She saw in William, this jovial, brilliant, malleable giant, the raw material she needed to fulfill that vow. The dynamic of their marriage was established early. Nellie was the architect. William was the bricklayer. When he was offered a seat on the Supreme Court early in his career, his literal dream job, it was Nellie who made him turn it down. She told him it was a shelf, a place for old men to die. She wanted him in the arena. She pushed him into the political fray, a world he found noisy, chaotic, and fundamentally dishonest. And every time she pushed, he retreated further into his own body. He could not say no to her. He worshipped her, and he feared her disappointment more than he feared his own unhappiness. So he swallowed his objections, and then he swallowed everything else. The second warden was even more formidable. Theodore Roosevelt was not just a president. He was a force of nature. If Nellie was the architect of Taft's misery, Roosevelt was the battering ram. The relationship between the two men was one of the most complex and destructive in American history. They called each other Will and Theodore, but the power dynamic was never equal. Roosevelt was the alpha, the kinetic genius, the man who sucked the air out of every room. Taft was his loyal lieutenant, his big will, the reliable, smiling giant who cleaned up Roosevelt's messes. Roosevelt used Taft as a blunt instrument of foreign policy. He sent him to the Philippines to be the governor general, a task of immense logistical and diplomatic difficulty. He sent him to Cuba to quell revolutions. He sent him to Rome to negotiate with the Pope, and Taft went. He always went. He was the perfect number two, diligent, loyal to a fault, and utterly incapable of refusing a command from the man he idolized. But the stress of being Roosevelt's shadow was killing him. It was during these years of service, specifically during his tenure as Secretary of War, that the cracks in the foundation began to show. The eating moved from a habit to a pathology. Menus from this era survive as documents of self-destruction. This behavior defied natural hunger. Consuming a 12-course dinner spoke not of appetite, but of a desperate need to numb a sensation of dread. Taft's relationship with food became a spectacle of state. At a breakfast in Savannah, he was recorded consuming 2 whole broiled chickens, a platter of hominy, endless biscuits soaked in butter, and a pot of coffee, all while discussing tariff reform. At a possum banquet in Atlanta, a political ritual of the time, he consumed an entire roast opossum surrounded by sweet potatoes, claiming it was delicious, while the grease visibly stained his shirt front. He was anesthetizing himself against the pressures of a job he hated. But the body has limits, and physics is a cruel judge. There is a specific incident, largely scrubbed from the heroic biographies, but preserved in the private diaries of diplomats, that foreshadowed the humiliation of his presidency. It is the Moscow incident. Years before the White House, while serving as Roosevelt's Secretary of War, Taft was sent on a diplomatic mission to Russia to meet with Tsar Nicholas II. This was the height of imperial pomp. The Russian court was the most formal, rigid environment on earth. Appearance was everything. Taft, already weighing over 300 pounds, was squeezed into a formal frock coat and striped trousers, the uniform of the diplomat. The disaster occurred during a formal arrival ceremony. A royal carriage, high-stepped and gilded, awaited him. The Tsar's guards stood at rigid attention. The elite of St. Petersburg were watching. Taft approached the carriage. The step was unusually high. He had to hoist his massive frame upward, shifting his entire 300 pounds onto one leg to make the ascent. As he lunged upward, the fabric of his trousers, strained to the breaking point by his girth, surrendered. The sound was reportedly like a gunshot, a sharp, tearing crack that echoed across the cobblestones. The seat of the American Secretary of War's pants had exploded. It was a moment of absolute freezing horror. The cold Russian air rushed in. The white of his undergarments was visible to the Imperial Guard. Any other man might have died of shame on the spot. But here we see the tragedy of Taft's personality. He did not storm off. He did not demand a cover. He simply froze, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. And then, with a terrible forced smile, he shuffled backward. He finished the engagement by keeping his back strictly against the carriage seat, maneuvering his long coat to hide the catastrophe. He turned the moment into a joke later, chuckling about his expansiveness. But those who knew him saw the truth. It was a warning. His body was literally bursting out of the costume of the statesman. The role did not fit, but neither Nellie nor Roosevelt was listening to the sound of the tearing cloth. They only heard the applause of the crowd. The turning point, the sentencing hearing for his imprisonment, came in 1908. Roosevelt decided he would not run for a third term. He needed a successor, a puppet who would continue his progressive crusade. He chose Taft. He didn't ask Taft, he informed him. The scene of the nomination is heartbreaking. Taft sat with Roosevelt in the White House library. Roosevelt paced, manic and energetic, outlining the future. He told Taft, "You shall be the president." Taft slumped in his chair. He tried to protest. He mentioned his dream of the Supreme Court again, a faint, dying plea. Roosevelt waved it away. Nellie, who was present in spirit, if not in body, during these negotiations, was ecstatic. Her dream was coming true. During the 1908 campaign, the stress eating accelerated into a frenzy. Campaigning in that era was a physical ordeal, train rides, stump speeches, endless banquets. For a man of Taft's size, it was torture. The heat of the train cars was unbearable for him. He sweated profusely, soaking through 3 or 4 suits a day. And at every stop, there was food. Voters wanted to see the big bill they read about in the papers. They brought him cakes. They prepared massive barbecues. And Taft, unable to reject their hospitality and desperate for the dopamine hit of sugar and fat, ate it all. He gained nearly 40 pounds during the campaign alone. He was expanding in real time, a balloon being inflated by the expectations of others. There is a terrifying account from a journalist on the campaign train. Late at night, while the staff slept, Taft was found in the dining car. He was alone. He was not reading policy papers. He was not writing speeches. He was eating. Silently, methodically, he was consuming a steak, his eyes fixed on the darkness rushing by the window. He looked, the journalist noted, like a man serving a life sentence. When he won the election beating William Jennings Bryan, the headline was, "Taft wins," but the reality was, Nellie wins. The night of the election, Nellie Taft broke precedent. She demanded a ride in the carriage with him from the Capitol to the White House, taking the seat usually reserved for the outgoing president. She sat beside him triumphant, her eyes scanning the cheering crowds. Beside her sat William, the new president of the United States, smiling that famous crinkled smile. But inside the carriage, he was already asleep. The narcolepsy had begun to set in. The oxygen was thinning. He had achieved the highest office in the land, and his body's only response was to try to lose consciousness. He had walked willingly into the cell, and as the gates of the White House closed behind him, the two wardens, the ambition of his wife and the legacy of his friend, locked the door. Now he was alone with the food, the pressure, and the terrible realization that he had to actually do the job. The tragedy was that he was not incompetent. He was simply miscast. And a miscast actor on the world stage does not just fail, he creates havoc. As 1909 dawned, the sleeping giant was about to wake up to a world he was too heavy to manage. The big lub persona, which had protected him for so long, was about to be stripped away, revealing the terrified, gasping man underneath. The fat was no longer a shield. It was about to become his tomb. The inauguration of 1909 was not a beginning. It was an ending. As the heavy winter snows of Washington melted into the humid, oppressive heat of a District of Columbia spring, the reality of the presidency settled upon William Howard Taft like a physical weight. The adrenaline of the campaign, the artificial energy provided by Nellie's ambition and Roosevelt's bullying, evaporated. What remained was a man alone in a room, surrounded by the machinery of the executive branch, with a body that was actively conspiring to shut him down. The atmosphere of the Taft White House explains the failure of his administration. Under Roosevelt, the executive mansion had been a gymnasium, a frat house, a center of kinetic, violent energy. Men boxed in the hallways, arguments were shouted, the air crackled. Under Taft, the White House became a sanatorium. The curtains were drawn against the sun. The air grew still. The sounds of shouting were replaced by the heavy, rhythmic wheezing of a man struggling to pull oxygen into lungs that were being crushed from the outside in. The medical reality of the Pickwickian syndrome we discussed earlier was now the dominant force in American politics. It wasn't just that Taft was fat, it was that his blood chemistry was fundamentally altering his perception of time and urgency. The carbon dioxide building up in his bloodstream acted as a sedative. It made him placid. It made him slow. It stripped him of the aggression necessary to govern a fractured party. The first casualty of this lethargy was the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act. This was supposed to be his great progressive victory. He had campaigned on lowering tariffs, a direct promise to the American consumer. But when the bill entered the Senate, the conservative wolves, led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, tore it to shreds. They raised rates on hundreds of items. A younger, healthier Taft, the steamroller of the courtroom, would have fought. He would have used the bully pulpit. He would have vetoed. But President Taft was tired. He was physically incapable of the sustained high-energy combat required to whip the Senate into line. He simply gave up. He signed the bill. He even called it the best bill the Republican Party ever passed, a statement of such political tone deafness that it stunned his allies. It was the statement of a man who just wanted the argument to end so he could go back to dinner. The progressives in his party, the men who worshipped Roosevelt, watched this surrender with open mouths. They didn't see a compromise. They saw a man too lazy to fight. But the tariff betrayal was nothing compared to the catastrophe of the Bollinger-Pont Show affair. This is the event that truly broke the presidency, and it is a perfect case study of how Taft's physical state dictated his political fate. The cast of characters is crucial. On one side, Gifford Pinchot, the chief forester. Pinchot was a Roosevelt disciple, lean, fanatical, a man who believed in conservation with religious zeal. On the other, Richard Ballinger, Taft's Secretary of the Interior. Ballinger was a lawyer, a strict constructionist, a man who believed in the letter of the law. Pinchot accused Ballinger of corruption regarding coal claims in Alaska. It was a messy, complex legal dispute. Taft, the former judge, looked at the evidence. His legal mind, still sharp even through the fog of sleep apnea, saw that Ballinger had done nothing illegal. Pinchot was acting on emotion. Ballinger was acting on statute. So Taft sided with Ballinger. He fired Pinchot for insubordination. Legally, he was right. Politically, it was suicide. By firing Pinchot, he was firing the spirit of Theodore Roosevelt. The press exploded. They painted Taft not as a principled judge, but as a tool of the interests, a fat, corrupt puppet of big business who was selling off America's natural resources while he slept. And he was sleeping. This is where the tragedy moves from the political to the visceral. The stress of the Ballinger controversy sent Taft into a spiral of consumption and narcolepsy that is terrifying to read about in the retrospective diaries of his aides. During the height of the scandal, Taft's weight ballooned even further, approaching 350 pounds. The heavier he got, the more he slept. It became the open secret of Washington, a macabre joke whispered in the cloakrooms of the Capitol. The President of the United States was falling unconscious in public. The incidents were numerous and they were horrifying. There is the famous account of a meeting with the Speaker of the House, Uncle Joe Cannon. Cannon was a loud, abrasive man, shouting about legislative priorities. Taft sat across from him, nodding. Cannon thought the president was agreeing. Then, a low, wet snore interrupted the speaker's tirade. Taft's chin had dropped to his chest. His eyes were rolled back. He was gone. Cannon reportedly stared in disbelief, then simply got up and left, leaving the leader of the free world unconscious in his chair. Then there was the funeral of Supreme Court Justice Harlan, a solemn, dignified affair. The entire Washington establishment was present. Taft sat in the front row, a massive figure in black. Midway through the eulogy, the silence of the cathedral was broken not by weeping, but by the rhythmic, choking sound of the president snoring. An aide had to nudge him awake. He, startled, looked around with confused, glassy eyes, and then, minutes later, drifted off again. But perhaps the most damaging incident, the one that sealed his reputation as a buffoon, occurred at a baseball game. It was a match involving the Detroit Tigers and the legendary Ty Cobb. Taft was a fan. He had, after all, started the tradition of the seventh-inning stretch simply because he needed to stand up to relieve the pressure on his sciatic nerve. During the game, the action was intense. The crowd was roaring. Cobb was stealing bases, a blur of violence and speed. In the presidential box, surrounded by photographers, William Howard Taft fell asleep. His head lolled back. His mouth fell open. The cameras clicked. The image was devastating. Here was the American ideal of vitality, baseball, contrasted with the American reality of leadership, a comatose giant. Behind the scenes, the situation was even grimmer. The fog that Taft lived in made him irritable and paranoid. When he was awake, he was often short-tempered, snapping at aides who tried to hurry him. He developed a hatred for the press that bordered on the pathological. He refused to read the newspapers because they upset him, and when he was upset, he ate. He would retreat to the residential quarters, where he would consume vast quantities of steak, potatoes, and sugary desserts. He became obsessed with golf, not for the sport, but for the escape. He would spend hours on the links, hitting the ball and walking slowly, refusing to discuss politics. The press mocked this too. They called it government by golf. They didn't understand that he was trying to walk off the carbon dioxide that was poisoning his brain. And then The final blow to his isolation struck. Nellie Taft, the architect, the warden, the driving force, collapsed. In May 1909, just months into the presidency, Nellie suffered a massive stroke. It robbed her of her speech. The woman who had pushed him, nagged him, and steered him was suddenly silenced. She was an invalid. This tragedy is often overlooked, but it is the key to the psychological collapse of the administration. Taft was bereft. He sat by her bedside for hours, holding her hand, teaching her to speak again like a child. The only thing I ever wanted was to make her happy, he told a friend. And now look. Without Nellie's sharp political instincts to guide him, and without Roosevelt's energy to protect him, Taft was completely unmoored. He was a ship without a rudder, drifting in a storm of his own making. He turned to his only other comfort, dollar diplomacy. This policy was the perfect expression of his personality. Taft believed that American bullets should be replaced by American dollars. He wanted to buy stability in Latin America and Asia rather than fight for it. It was a lawyer's solution to a soldier's world. It was rational, it was bloodless, and it was a disaster. In Nicaragua, in Honduras, in China, Taft's attempts to use loans to control governments backfired. The money was stolen. The debts caused resentment. The banana republics were born not from American strength, but from American clumsiness. Taft didn't understand the passions of revolutionaries because he had no passion himself. He viewed the world as a court case, solvable with contracts and settlements. He couldn't understand why people would fight when they could just be paid. By 1910, the midterms were a slaughter. The Democrats took the House. The Republicans were in open civil war. Taft was isolated in the White House, a prisoner of the Blue Room, eating his way through the despair. He began to write pathetic letters to Roosevelt, who was away on a safari in Africa, hunting lions. "I've had a hard time," Taft wrote, pleading for understanding. "I have done my best." The letters went unanswered, or worse, they were answered with silence. The narrative of the Taft presidency had become one of grotesque incompetence. The public saw a fat man who slept while the country burned. They didn't see the struggle. They didn't see the terrifying biology of a man whose diaphragm was too weak to lift the weight of his own chest. They didn't see the sleep apnea that woke him 100 times a night, leaving him shattered by dawn. They only saw the monster, the big lub, the joke. But the joke was about to end. The safari was over. In the jungles of Africa, Theodore Roosevelt was reading the newspapers. He was reading about the firing of Ponchot. He was reading about the tariff. He was reading about the sleeping president. And he was getting angry. Roosevelt was returning. The bull moose was coming home to reclaim his herd. And William Howard Taft, trapped in his bathtub of a presidency, tired, sick, and lonely, was the only thing standing in his way. The stage was set not for an election, but for an execution. The year of 1911 passed in a haze of legislative failures and deepening obesity. Taft's weight fluctuated wildly, but the trend was always upward. He tried diets, the Fletcherism method of chewing food, hundreds of times, but he always relapsed. He was an addict. The stress of the coming confrontation with Roosevelt triggered a biological panic. His body was hoarding energy for a fight it knew it couldn't win. As the election year of 1912 approached, the atmosphere in the White House changed from a sanatorium to a bunker. Taft knew what was coming. He knew he wasn't just facing a political opponent. He was facing the destruction of the most important friendship of his life. He was the incumbent president, yet he felt like the underdog. He controlled the machinery of the party, Yet he felt powerless. He was the most powerful man on earth, yet he couldn't stay awake through dinner. The tragedy of the narcoleptic presidency is not that he slept. It is that he was awake enough to know he was failing and helpless to stop it. He was watching his own political death in slow motion through the blurry, heavy-lidded eyes of a man who just wanted to lie down. The executioner was at the door, and he was bringing the press with him. Washington did not simply turn a page on the calendar to reach 1912. The city felt a shift in atmospheric pressure, a heaviness that settled over the executive mansion and pressed the air out of the rooms. For William Howard Taft, this was not merely an election year. It was the year his personal and political universe would be dismantled piece by piece by the only man he had ever truly loved as a brother. Stripping away the sanitized history of a political disagreement between Republicans reveals the sheer brutality of what followed. This was not a disagreement. It was a domestic abuse case played out on a national scale. It was a Greek tragedy where the Creator returns to destroy his creation. Theodore Roosevelt was back from Africa, and he was not bringing souvenirs. He was bringing a knife. The prelude to the execution began in the winter of 1911. The White House had become a mausoleum of silence. The jovial, backslapping atmosphere of the early Roosevelt years was a distant memory. Taft, now weighing over 340 pounds, moved through the corridors like a ghost in a diving suit. The staff spoke in whispers. The president was eating. The president was sleeping. The president was weeping. These were the updates that circulated among the aides. The stress of the impending confrontation with Roosevelt had triggered a biological panic in Taft's body. His cells were hoarding energy, anticipating a famine that would never come. He was eating to build a fortification against the heartbreak. When Roosevelt finally declared his candidacy in February 1912, saying, "My hat is in the ring," the metaphor was violent. He wasn't throwing a hat, he was throwing a gauntlet. The reaction in the Taft White House was one of physical collapse. Taft didn't rage, he didn't throw furniture, he simply slumped. He told his aide Archie Butt, a man who tragically served both masters and would soon die on the Titanic, torn between his loyalty to both, that he felt like a man who had been kicked by his own horse. The betrayal was absolute. Taft had spent 4 years trying to interpret Roosevelt's will, trying to be the good boy, trying to keep the progressive flame alive while adhering to the Constitution. And now the Great White Father was calling him a traitor. The primary campaign that spring was a spectacle of grotesquerie that the American public had never seen before and has rarely seen since. It was a traveling circus of insults. Roosevelt, manic and energized by the conflict, crisscrossed the country on train cars, leaning off the back platforms to scream at crowds. His language was not political, it was visceral. He attacked Taft's body. He attacked his mind. He called the President of the United States a fathead. He called him a puzzle wit. He called him a flub-dub with a streak of the second rate. These were playground taunts, designed to humiliate a man he knew was incapable of fighting back. Roosevelt knew Taft's weakness was his gentleness, and he exploited it with the ruthlessness of a predator culling a sick herd animal. Taft's response to this barrage was agonizing to watch. He was forced onto the campaign trail, a place he loathed. Imagine the physics of it. A 350-pound man squeezed into the stifling heat of a pre-air-conditioned train car, vibrating for hours on uneven tracks, expected to stand up at every whistle stop and deliver a fiery defense of his administration. He couldn't do it. He would stand there, sweating profusely, his massive frame shaking with the effort of simply remaining upright, and he would stammer. He would try to talk about the law, about the sanctity of the judiciary, about the tariff schedules. The crowds, whipped into a frenzy by Roosevelt, would heckle him. They would chant, "Soak him, Teddy." They would laugh at his size. They would throw cabbages. The lowest point came in April, in a train station in Massachusetts. A reporter, perhaps sensing the president's vulnerability, asked him a direct question about one of Roosevelt's accusations, that Taft was part of a corrupt alliance with big business. Taft looked at the reporter. He looked at the crowd. He opened his mouth to defend his honor, to cite his prosecutions of trust, to explain his adherence to the law. But the words failed. His face, expansive and usually composed, crumbled. The President of the United States buried his face in his hands and began to sob. He cried openly, his great shoulders heaving, the tears disappearing into the folds of his neck. "Roosevelt was my closest friend," he choked out. It was the sound of a heart breaking on the public record. Back in the safety of the private car, or later in the White House, the eating became suicidal. This is the period where Taft's weight hit its absolute historical peak, likely touching 355 or even 360 pounds. He was consuming calories as if he were trying to suffocate the grief. He would eat massive steaks for breakfast, followed by sugary pastries, followed by heavy lunches of mutton and potatoes. He would fall asleep at the table, wake up, and eat again. The narcolepsy was now constant. He fell asleep during briefings on the primary results. He fell asleep while dictating letters to his wife. He was a man trying to escape his own life by rendering himself unconscious. The humiliation deepened when the votes came in. In the primaries, a relatively new invention in American politics, Roosevelt crushed him. In state after state, the people chose the bull moose. They chose the energy. They chose the violence. Even in Ohio, Taft's home state, the rejection was stinging. To lose your home is to lose your foundation. Taft saw the numbers and understood the verdict. The people did not want him. They viewed him as an error, a placeholder who had overstayed his welcome. But William Howard Taft was also a creature of the law, and while Roosevelt had the votes, Taft had the gavel. The Republican National Convention in Chicago in June 1912 was the scene of the crime. It was here that Taft, the gentle giant, the man who hated conflict, decided to commit a political felony. He decided to steal the nomination. He did not do it for ambition. He did not want to be president for another day, let alone 4 years. He did it because he genuinely believed Theodore Roosevelt had gone insane. Roosevelt had begun attacking the courts, suggesting that popular majorities could overturn judicial rulings. To Taft, the former judge, this was the end of civilization. It was mob rule. It was Jacobinism. So Taft used the machinery of the incumbency. He controlled the credentials committee. He controlled the seating charts. He controlled the police. When Roosevelt's delegates arrived in Chicago screaming for justice, Taft's machine simply disqualified them. They were locked out behind barbed wire. Literally, there was barbed wire around the podium to prevent physical assaults. The convention floor was a riot. Men punched each other. Chairs were thrown. Senator Elihu Root, presiding over the chaos, looked down at a sea of hatred. Through it all, Taft stayed in Washington, hovering over the telegraph, directing the theft. He secured the nomination. He won, but it was the victory of a man who burns down his own house to stop a burglar. Roosevelt's reaction was apocalyptic. He bolted the convention. He took his delegates and marched to a different hall to form the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party. He declared, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." He effectively guaranteed that the Republican vote would be split in half, handing the election to the Democrats. He knew this. Taft knew this. The general election was over before it began. It was a suicide pact. The summer and autumn of 1912 were a slow death march. Taft, now the official nominee, simply stopped trying. He refused to campaign. He told his staff that he would not go around the country making a spectacle of myself. He retreated into the White House, turning it into a fortress of solitude. He played golf obsessively, waddling around the greens in the humid heat, hitting the ball and walking, hitting and walking, trying to outrun the shame. The press mocked him for it. They called it government by golf. They said he was fiddling while Rome burned. They didn't understand that for Taft, the golf course was the only place where he could breathe. The open air was the only antidote to the carbon dioxide poisoning his brain. Then came the moment that crystallized the difference between the two men. In October, in Milwaukee, Theodore Roosevelt was shot. An assassin named John Schrank fired a Colt revolver into Roosevelt's chest at point-blank range. The bullet passed through a steel spectacle case and a 50-page folded speech, lodging in his chest muscle, just shy of the lung. Roosevelt coughed into his hand, saw no blood, and concluded the lung was intact. He refused medical attention. He walked onto the stage, unbuttoned his vest to reveal the blood-soaked shirt to the gasped horror of the crowd, and roared, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He spoke for 90 minutes with a bullet in his chest. The contrast was devastating. It was mythological. Here was Roosevelt, the warrior, bleeding but unbowed, superhuman in his vitality. And there was Taft, silent in Washington, defeated by a flight of stairs, trapped in a bathtub, incapacitated by a heavy lunch. The image of the bleeding Roosevelt destroyed whatever shred of respect the public had left for Taft. It wasn't just a political defeat, it was a biological judgment. The country looked at the two men and saw one as the pinnacle of evolution and the other as a cul-de-sac of gluttony. Taft's reaction to the shooting was characteristic. He was horrified. He suspended all political activity. He sent a tender, desperate telegram to Roosevelt, expressing his shock and love. Roosevelt did not reply. The silence from the hospital bed in Chicago was louder than any scream. It was the final severance. Election Day, November 5th, 1912, arrived with the inevitability of a funeral. The weather was crisp. Taft voted in Cincinnati, then returned to the White House to wait for the end. The mood in the executive offices was grim. The clerks tallied the returns in hushed tones. The telegraph keys chattered out the autopsy of the administration. The results were catastrophic. They were historical in their badness. Woodrow Wilson, the austere professor from Princeton, swept the country. Theodore Roosevelt, running on a third-party ticket, came in second, a feat never accomplished before or since. He won 6 states and 88 electoral votes, and William Howard Taft, the sitting president, the head of the grand old party, he won 2 states, Utah and Vermont, 80 electoral votes. It was an annihilation. He had been erased. He had carried 23% of the popular vote. It was the worst performance by an incumbent president in the history of the United States. He hadn't just lost, he had been repudiated by the American people. They had looked at his weight, his sleepiness, his judicial temperament, and they had violently rejected it. The staff in the Oval Office trembled as they handed him the final tally. They expected a collapse. They expected a heart attack. They expected the final fatal onset of the Pickwickian gloom. Taft took the paper. He adjusted his glasses. He read the numbers. Utah, Vermont, the end of the road. And then a strange sound filled the room, a low rumble, a shaking of the jowls. William Howard Taft threw his head back and laughed. Devoid of madness or bitterness, it was simply the laugh of a man who had just been told that his prison sentence was commuted. He slapped his knee. He turned to his friend Gus Carger and said, with a lightness that had been missing for 4 years, "I don't care how we went down. The point is, we are out." He was giddy. He was relieved. The crushing weight of the presidency, the weight that had forced him to eat, the weight that had forced him to sleep, was gone. He had been fired, and it was the best news he had ever received. He told his wife, Nellie, who was still recovering from her stroke, that they were going home, not to the White House, but to a life where he could be himself. That night, as the Democrats celebrated in the streets and Roosevelt stewed in his defeat, William Howard Taft slept. For the first time in 4 years, he slept not because his brain was starving for oxygen, but because he was at peace. The nightmare was over. The public execution was complete, and the victim had survived. But the story does not end in the ruins of 1912. The fat man was dead, political speaking, but the brilliant man inside was just waking up. The tragedy of the presidency was the necessary fire that burned away the ambition that had been imposed upon him. Now, stripped of power, stripped of dignity, and stripped of his false identity, William Howard Taft was ready to do the impossible. He was ready to stop eating. He was ready to wake up. He was ready to become the man he was always meant to be. The execution was actually a liberation. The prisoner of flesh had found the key, and it lay in the most unlikely place: total, absolute defeat. The morning of March 4th, 1913, should have been the nadir of William Howard Taft's existence. It was Inauguration Day for Woodrow Wilson. The city of Washington was awash in Democratic blue, marking the first time in 16 years that a Democrat would occupy the White House. The crowds were chanting for the new freedom. Taft, the defeated incumbent, the man humiliated by the Bull Moose Rebellion, the man who had won only 2 states in the Electoral College, was required by tradition to ride in an open carriage beside the man who had taken his job. To the thousands lining Pennsylvania Avenue, Taft looked like a relic of a bygone era, a massive, silent, defeated giant in a top hat, being ushered off the stage of history to make way for the lean, intellectual modernity of Wilson. But if you look closely at the photographs from that day, you see something extraordinary. Woodrow Wilson looks terrified. His face is pinched, his eyes darting, already feeling the crushing weight of the office settling onto his narrow shoulders. Beside him, William Howard Taft is beaming. He is smiling with a radiance that borders on inappropriate for a loser. He looks like a man who has just been told his terminal diagnosis was a clerical error. As the carriage rolled away from the Capitol, Taft turned to Wilson and said with absolute sincerity, "I'm glad to be going. This is the lonesomest place in the world." The moment he boarded the train at Union Station to leave Washington, the transformation began. It was not gradual. It was immediate. The prison of the presidency had been unlocked, and the prisoner walked out into the fresh air of private life. For 4 years, his body had been a fortress of fat built to withstand the shelling of politics. Now, the war was over. The fortifications could come down. Taft retreated to New Haven, Connecticut, to take up a position as a professor of law at Yale. It was a return to the womb. He had been happy at Yale as a student. Now he was ecstatic as a teacher. But the most shocking change was not professional. It was physical. Almost immediately, without the cortisol spikes of the Oval Office, without the late-night stress-eating sessions in the White House pantry, and without the crushing responsibility of the tariff schedules, Taft began to shrink. He hired a medical consultant, Dr. Radcliffe, but this time he actually listened to him. He cut out the potatoes. He cut out the bread. He cut out the fatty meats that had been his anesthetic. He began to walk. Not the slow, lumbering shuffle of the president, but the brisk, long-legged stride of the man he used to be. He walked 3 miles a day, then 5. The results were medically enhancing. In less than a year, William Howard Taft lost 75 pounds. The physics of such a transformation were staggering. He had essentially shed the equivalent of a large child from his frame. The Pickwickian syndrome, the obesity hypoventilation that had plagued his presidency, vanished. The sleep apnea that had terrified his wife stopped. The narcolepsy, the micro-sleeps that had made him a national joke, disappeared completely. His brain, flooded with oxygen for the first time in a decade, woke up. The students at Yale did not see a fathead or a puzzle wit. They saw a brilliant, engaging, and deeply funny legal scholar. He was popular. He was beloved. He told stories about the absurdity of the White House with a self-deprecating wit that charmed everyone. He was finally playing the role he was cast for, the wise elder, the teacher, the judge. But there was one ghost that still haunted the feast, Theodore Roosevelt. For years, the silence between the two men had been absolute. The bitterness of 1912 had calcified into a wall of ice. But time and the cooling of political passions began to melt it. In 1918, a chance encounter occurred in the dining room of the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago. It is a scene that deserves to be in every history book. Taft was eating breakfast alone. He saw Roosevelt enter the room. The entire dining hall went silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Everyone watched. Would they fight? Would they ignore each other? Taft, now leaner, healthier, and unburdened by the presidency, stood up. He didn't hesitate. He opened his arms and walked across the room. Roosevelt, aged by his jungle explorations and the loss of his son in the Great War, looked at his old friend. The bull moose aggression was gone. He saw only will. They embraced. The dining room erupted in applause. They sat and talked for 20 minutes, not about politics, but about their children, about their health, about the old days. It wasn't a full restoration. The scars were too deep, but it was peace. When Roosevelt died suddenly a year later in 1919, Taft was devastated. He wept openly at the funeral, the last survivor of a friendship that had shaped the 20th century. With Roosevelt gone, the last link to the trauma of the executive branch was severed. Taft was free to look forward, and what he saw was the glitter of his true ambition. The year 1921 arrived. Warren G. Harding, a Republican, was in the White House. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Edward Douglas White, died. This was the moment. Taft had spent his entire life waiting for this phone call. He had accepted the governorship of the Philippines, the Secretary of War post, and even the presidency, all as consolation prizes. He had endured the fat jokes, the humiliating cartoons, the bathtub incident, and the 1912 defeat, all while harboring this secret, burning desire. Harding nominated him. The Senate confirmed him the same day by a voice vote. There was no debate. The country knew this was where he belonged. On July 11, 1921, William Howard Taft took the oath of office. He put on the black robes, and a transformation occurred that was almost spiritual. The chaotic, sweating, fumbling politician vanished. In his place sat the big chief. He is the only person in American history to have held both offices, President and Chief Justice, and he was unequivocal about which one he preferred. "I don't remember that I ever was president," he famously said, "but I know that I am Chief Justice." Taft's tenure on the court was not a retirement, it was a revolution. He attacked the job with a ferocity he had never shown in the White House. He found the Supreme Court in a state of disarray. It was backed up by years of cases. It was inefficient. It was operating on 19th century rules in a 20th century world. Taft, the administrator, took over. He didn't just decide cases, he redesigned the entire federal judiciary. He lobbied Congress, something judges rarely did, for the Judiciary Act of 1925. This law is the reason the Supreme Court is powerful today. Before Taft, the court had to hear almost every case that was appealed to it. It was drowning in trivia. Taft's law gave the court certiorari, the power to choose which cases it would hear. It allowed the court to focus only on constitutional questions of national importance. It transformed the court from a tribunal of last resort into a co-equal branch of government with the power to shape society. He was the architect of the modern judicial system. He streamlined the procedures. He unified the lower courts. He managed the other justices, often a collection of brilliant but difficult egos, with the same jovial charm that had failed him in politics, but worked perfectly in the conference room. He was a uniter on the bench, in a way he never could be on the campaign trail. But his greatest physical legacy was yet to come. Taft looked around the Capitol building, where the Supreme Court was housed. They were stuck in the basement, in the old Senate chamber. It was cramped, dark, and undignified. The head of the judiciary branch was essentially living in the attic of the legislative branch. Taft was offended by this. He believed the law deserved a temple. He began a relentless campaign to build a separate building for the Supreme Court. He lobbied Congress for the money. He selected the architect, Cass Gilbert. He pored over the blueprints. He envisioned a building of white marble modeled after the Parthenon, a structure that projected permanence, authority, and silence. He was building a house that fit his soul. The White House had been a trap, too public, too noisy, too chaotic. The Supreme Court building was to be a sanctuary, quiet, majestic, eternal. He laid the cornerstone in 1929. He would not live to see it finished, but every column, every step, every inch of that marble palace is a monument to William Howard Taft's vision. When you look at the Supreme Court today, you are looking at Taft's answer to the bathtub. The bathtub was the symbol of his physical confinement. The court building is the symbol of his intellectual liberation. By 1930, the years began to take their toll. The weight, which he had fought so valiantly for a decade, began to creep back as his heart weakened. But this time, it was not a moral failing. It was simply age. The Pickwickian nightmare did not return. He remained sharp, lucid, and commanding until the very end. He resigned from the court in February 1930 when his health finally failed. He had achieved everything he set out to do. He had redeemed his name. He had rebuilt the legal system. He had lost the weight and then found a different kind of gravitas. He died a month later, on March 8, 1930. The reaction of the nation was markedly different from the ridicule of 1912. There were no cartoons of fat men. There were no jokes about sleeping. The newspapers spoke of the great Chief Justice. They spoke of his dignity, his fairness, his administrative genius. He was the first president to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, later joined by JFK. It was a soldier's resting place for a man who had fought a war against his own biology and won. History has been cruel to the prisoner of flesh. History has been cruel to William Howard Taft. Pop culture has reduced him to a punchline, the guy who got stuck in the tub. It is a lazy shorthand for excess. But if we look at the full arc of his life, we see a story of profound resilience. This was a man who was psychologically and physically unsuited for the presidency, yet he endured it. He was a man who was literally suffocating under the weight of his own body, poisoning his own brain with carbon dioxide. Yet he managed to steer the ship of state through a turbulent era without crashing it. He was a victim of the Peter principle. He was promoted to the level of his incompetence by a wife and a friend who loved him but did not understand him. He was a gentle judge forced to be a ruthless king. But his second act, his resurrection, is the true lesson. Taft teaches us that failure is not a permanent condition. The humiliation of 1912, the public execution, was the best thing that ever happened to him. It stripped away the false identity. It forced him to confront his addiction to food. It forced him to confront the expectations of others. He is the only man in American history who can look at the presidency of the United States and say, "That was the worst job I ever had," and mean it. His legacy is not the bathtub. His legacy is the white marble temple that stands across from the Capitol. It is the Judiciary Act. It is the modern Supreme Court. In the end, William Howard Taft escaped the prison. He broke the vacuum seal. He shed the weight. He stopped sleeping and started building. He proved that while the body can be a cage, the mind, if given enough oxygen and enough purpose, can break through the bars. He was not just a fat man who fell. He was a great man who, after falling, stood up, dusted off his knees, and walked into history on his own terms.